Hello everyone and welcome back to Plankton's Robotic Revenge. This is the upgrade screen where we can buy and upgrade new weapons. I'm going to be buying the pie launcher, my brother the condiment cannon, and my sister the reef blower. We're all going to have at least 2 weapons, but I'll be sticking with the pie launcher for the duration of the run. So the way weapon types in this game work is they're more SpongeBob-y takes on traditional weapon types. The reef blower Sandy is using is the shotgun type weapon. The pie launcher is the grenade type weapon that fires in an arc and deals a lot of splash damage. And the condiment cannon is your standard machine gun type weapon. It takes a while to start up but fires very fast. I forgot to mention my brother Mr. Krabs already purchased his second weapon, which is the tartar sauce gun, so he has the tartar sauce gun and condiment cannon. The tartar sauce gun fires in a constant stream and auto-locks onto the nearest enemy, hitting it without fail. It is the gun that deals the most consistent damage, it deals very high damage, and it takes the longest to upgrade. The reason my brother was able to afford both the condiment cannon and tartar sauce gun is because Mr. Krabs collects more money than all the other players. That is his superpower. Each character has a unique superpower they can use when that bar under their health fills up. SpongeBob becomes invincible, Mr. Krabs gets more money, and Sandy deals higher melee damage whenever they use their super meter. Now about the weapon's specific weakness, the tartar gun can easily be interrupted if an object or person is standing in front of the stream of fire. The pie launcher takes quite a while to reach enemies unless the enemy is very close, and the reef blower has very short range. The gun that deals the most consistent and largest amount of damage in this situation is still the tartar sauce gun. But, you know, they tried to balance them so that way you wouldn't just want to use one the entire game, even though that's definitely an option. When you reach one of these terminals, all the money you collected is stored here, kind of like it's a bank, so the money will stay here if you die, but if you die before you put the money in the bank, then the money is just gone. So that's kind of a neat mechanic, you know, you want to survive long enough to reach the terminal and deposit your money. It's a shame it's so hard to die, otherwise that mechanic may get more notice. I've actually not seen people mention that mechanic. I seriously don't think I've ever seen someone bring up the fact that you deposit your sprockets into the terminals like a bank, and that's how you keep them. Maybe because it's just so hard to die they didn't even notice? Anyway, you may have noticed there's a new enemy type. These little buzzsaw spinny guys. We'll just call them spinners. The spinners come at you just like most enemies that charge at you, but you can't shoot them with your gun. You have to ground slam on the button on their head. It's the only way to defeat them. This requires a bit of deviation from the normal just hop around and shoot formula. Makes you have to pay more attention in combat so it doesn't become entirely mindless. How the spinners work is that after they charge at you for a certain period, they become tired and stand still, so it's easier to jump on their head and use the ground slam. But you can still ground slam on them while they're in mid-charge, it just requires more aiming. But I think being able to pull that off is quite fun. The spinners are also the first glimpse you get of the game's overall design, which is the idea that if they keep introducing more and more enemy types that fire at you or attack you in different ways, then eventually the game will become utterly crazy and will require more and more attention and be more fun to play. The enemies are generally placed in appropriately thoughtful positions. For example, the turrets are generally near the back, the melee enemies near the front, and the spinners somewhere in the middle, so that way they can cause the most inconvenience. The game does a decent job at introducing new enemy types or variations on old enemy types, but the game only really becomes crazy or challenging in the final world, in spite of the developer's best effort to shake things up by placing enemies in strategic positions, such as placing the turret up on that pedestal as you saw. The enemy types being placed in strategic positions is much more important in this game than it is in Hero Pants, partially because it's a shooter and partially because there's more variety in enemy types and the enemy types have more distinct behaviors. But I won't say that you need to pay absolute attention to the placement of enemy types, especially in the first world. And this is mostly because the developers gave you way too much health. At most, the characters should have 5 hit points, but instead they have 10, which is more than enough to just blindly fire your way through a lot of the levels and make it to the next checkpoint without issue. Ideally, the characters would have 3 health to optimize the challenge and make the game design more prevalent, but, you know, giving them 5 health is a good middle ground. But they have 10, which is just way too much. In spite of the thoughtful enemy placement, occasional changes in elevation, and variety in enemy types, the game never goes beyond what I would call mildly challenging. The final world is when it's at its best because everything is all together in full force, and if you had fewer hit points, then the final world might actually be, you know, hard. There are times when giving the player fewer hit points or giving the enemy characters more hit points is actually a valid way to increase the strategy the player has to use and highlight the game design. This game is definitely one of those cases. Because the player has so much health, the game feels far more mindless than it actually should. And if the players had fewer hit points, the enemy placement and the various enemy types would get their chance to shine, as opposed to just being cannon fodder, because you can tank so many hits. The odd hit you get here and there would suddenly become a lot more important. Like, you get hit 3, 4, even 5 times in a row, it's no big deal, because you still have more than enough health to make it to the next health chest or next checkpoint without any issue whatsoever. But if you had 3 hits, suddenly getting hit a couple times is a much bigger deal, because then you only have 1 hit left. There's some falling platforms here. Whenever there are falling platforms, the best idea, I think, is just to rush to the other side as quickly as possible. Because trying to fight the enemies while on falling platforms is bad. You will fall and die. While the combat may be too easy, the platforming is very, you either live or you don't. And it's not like the platforming is an incredibly large part of the game. It's very minimal. The falling platforms are mostly there to spice up the combat and make you watch where you put your footing while you're firing at the enemies and strafing around them. There's some light platforming later in the game, and like the fact that there are actual moving platforms, but it's not, you wouldn't call it a platformer. So you can see the next boss fight back there. It's currently shooting goo balls at us, which if we step in will cause us to get stuck and we have to press the A button to get out. It's a common theme in this game to introduce you to the boss fights earlier than you actually fight them. They appear in the stages leading up to them, and you get to see a few of their gimmicks before you fight them, which I actually think is a really cool idea. I love when games let you see the big bad boss fight before you actually fight it, and it has some sort of role in the stage or level design before you combat it directly. And this game does that for every boss. So it's pretty neat. It doesn't spice up the level design too much, but it does add new hazards that are unique to those bosses, so that's pretty cool. So, the thing about playing as anyone but Mr. Krabs is that leveling up your guns takes a very long time. Mr. Krabs can easily level up all the guns very, very quickly because his superpower gives him so much money. But everybody else has to level up their guns at a reasonable pace, and especially in multiplayer where the loot has to be shared, it can be more difficult to level up your guns, which is why we segregated the guns the way we did, and it's why I'm mostly using the pie launcher. Another thing about falling platforms is you have to be careful not to fuck over your friends, because, you know, if you walk on a platform and it falls and they try to jump on the same platform, they're gonna die. So you either need to communicate adequately or just rush to the other side of the falling platform section as quickly as possible. We went for the latter, because communicating is difficult. You understand. Hopefully you're getting the idea by watching that there is thought put into the level design, the enemy placement, and the enemy designs. You know, each section of combat is tailor-made to be challenging in a different way. It's just that I think the game's reputation for being mindless mostly comes from the fact that, again, the characters have way too much health for damage to actually mean anything. Also, you may have noticed we got a new turret type. This one oh, it's gone. I'll talk about it in a minute. Anyway, yeah, hopefully you can see that in spite of this game's reputation, there is game design here. There was thought put into what goes on. A lot of it, in fact, and they wanted to make a genuinely good game. It's just that it didn't work out that way. Not that the game is awful, I would argue the game is okay, And I would argue the enemy placements are above average. It's just that there are a couple of design decisions that prevent it from reaching its potential. I think we'll see the new turret in here again. Eventually. You can see the boss... Okay, the red turret right there. That one fires in an arc, and you can see a red circle on the ground where it fires at. The important thing about those red circles is that you cannot be inside of them. Not even if you're jumping, it doesn't matter where you are inside the red circle. If you're inside the red circle, you're getting hit. The red circle is basically just, if you stand here, you're going to take damage. And eventually the screen is going to be absolutely fucking full of red circles, just red circles everywhere, but that'll take a while. I mean, at its best, I think you could argue that Plankton's Robotic Revenge is a mix between a party game and a very light 3D bullet hell game. Because in the later stages, there's so many shots coming at you from so many different directions, and it gets absolutely nuts. Back when I first played this game in 2013, and I was generally more optimistic toward games, that was one of the first things I noticed, was that the game consistently threw more and more enemies at you and more shots at you as you went through the game. The idea was to eventually overwhelm the player. It would slowly introduce new enemy types and eventually introduce so many and so many different patterns that it would completely overwhelm you. It didn't work out that way because, again, you have too many hits. But that was the idea. Like you can see here, the new turret type is in the best position it possibly could be to shoot at you. It's just, not only do you have too many hits, but there's too few of them at the moment. Too few enemies, I mean. Another issue that prevents the design from being highlighted properly is that there's way too many health pickups. Like, way too many. There's at least one see, there's a health chest right there, even though we just got one. There's one section in particular where there are 4 health chests right next to each other, with only like 3 enemies in between them. I feel like maybe they were a little too worried about the game not being easy enough for children, because they made it so easy that it came at the expense of the game design, which is a shame because there was clearly thought put into the game design, in spite of the game's rather bad reputation. There also, and I find this to be a bit weird because it seems like a genre that has a lot of potential, there also aren't a lot of games like this one. There are so few that I don't think it even has a subgenre name. This sort of top-down shooter where you have an auto-lock on and there's a focus on multiplayer action. The only other game I can think of that's similar to this is Ratchet & Clank All for One. I'm sure there's more than just this and All for One, but that's all I can think of. These sections with moving platforms where you have turrets shooting at you, only really difficult in multiplayer. In single player, you can just stand on one of the far sides of the platform and all the shots will miss you, because rather than aim where you're going, the AI always aims where you're at, and because the platform is moving, they will miss you consistently. But in multiplayer, some of you are going to get hit, because you can't all occupy the same space. It's just a shame to me there's such a thin line separating this game, you know, from alright to good. If they just lowered the health and made less health chests, I think the game would actually be good instead of just okay and fun to play with friends. It's time for one of these weird free-falling segments again. Again, I'm not sure why these are here. I don't know what they add to the design. Maybe they're just there to wear down your health before you fight the boss, but they seem significantly more difficult than anything else in the game. I'm honestly surprised there's not a fuck ton of health pickups in this this free-falling section, but the free-falling section's maybe the only part that's genuinely difficult. You'll see Sandy, mate. Yep, Sandy's dead. I see people complaining about the environments in this game, saying they're lackluster, and while I can see where they're coming from, I think I will have to disagree. I think the environments actually look quite nice. It's just that you end up seeing them for too long. Like, I think the environments, the textures, the backgrounds, they all look great. It's just that you see the same color of background, the same textures, for way too long. It's not that the textures or background or scenery are bad, you just see it way too much. But, you know, when comparing this game to Hero Pants, it's like night and day. Everything is no longer segregated into squares. You can actually see the art assets look good, even if they were taken independently from the game. The character models are a lot more expressive and squishier. It's just... here's one of the first sections of the game you might consider genuinely challenging as far as shooting is concerned. There's very little room to move and a whole lot of turrets. Especially if you try to stay down there where the falling platforms are. It's not a lot of room to dodge. You can still jump around and get past the issue just fine, but, you know, maybe younger children might have issue with that. I do wish the game tried to limit your movement space a bit more, but I think really that wouldn't be necessary if you just had the right amount of health. I think the game's design and enemy placements would be just fine if you only had the appropriate amount of health, and I'm gonna keep saying that. So now that we're on another moving platform segment, which is very similar to the last one, I feel like we should talk about this game's versions. This game was released on the Wii, PS3, Wii U, Xbox 360, 3DS, and DS. On a lot of platforms. All of the console versions are really the same. The Wii U and PS3 versions definitely look the best graphically. The textures are higher quality, the character models are higher quality, and the game just in general looks better. Just overall looks a lot better. It looks more like a game released in 2013. But the only game with significant the only version of the game with significant gameplay differences is the DS version, because they couldn't make this game for the original DS. So instead what you get is a completely different game with the same name. And the one on the DS is a dual joystick shooter. Keep in mind, I am referring to the original DS, not the Nintendo 3DS. The 3DS version pretty much identical to what you're looking at right now. The DS version, though, is a top-down dual joystick shooter. And it's actually quite good, arguably better than this one. For one thing, it's actually challenging, unlike this one. For another thing, the level design is a lot more maze-like, a lot more labyrinthine, there's a lot more pushing of switches, a lot more pathfinding, and surprisingly there's more platforming, even though the platforming mechanics are less pronounced. Like in this game you have the traditional jump and double jump. But in the DS version, instead, you only jump when you reach the edge of a platform. This limitation actually makes the platforming more engaging and challenging. Like, the one on the DS is almost nothing like the console releases at all. It just has the same basic concept. And if you're wondering how there could be a dual joystick shooter on the DS, well, you know, there's a touchscreen, that's how. And it's actually controls really well. The weapon types are also a lot more pronounced in the DS version. For example, the Tartar gun now no longer fires like a laser. It fires in a sort of strange stream, but it fires slower than all of the other weapons, which means you have to lead your shots. But that's because the DS version is also much slower, so doing things like leading your shots is more, you know, reasonable. In this game, which moves a lot faster, the idea that you would have to lead your shots and dodge all the enemy fire is a little bit much for the target audience of this game, I think.
We gotta find that key. Cousin Sheldon is gonna be sorer than a wet toad at a square dance if he finds out we lost it.
SpongeBob, look! It's the key! It's stuck to that metal crate for brains.
If we move quickly, he'll never know what hit him.
Oh, I reckon I'll know what hit me. Don't you worry. I mean, you just told me what you're gonna do.
Come on, gang! Get him!
Alright, so this is the game's second boss fight, Rainchild. And Rainchild primarily uses lasers. We saw some of Rainchild's attacks earlier in the world. Rainchild used a sticky tar trap, which will stick us to the ground and we have to mash A to get out if it hits us. And Rainchild also used a giant laser that came out of the robot's mouth. Now this boss is arguably the easiest one in the game, because the lasers are so well telegraphed and easy to dodge, and in addition, the sticky tar balls Rainchild is shooting right now, you can just jump over them with no problem. Like, even if you stand perfectly still, you can jump over them. I do like the idea of Rainchild's attack pattern. I just think that it moves much too slowly. Here's another version of the attack we've already seen with the first boss battle, where we just stay in between the shots and fire. I'm not sure why they use that one twice, but you know, whatever. The idea behind all of Rainchild's attacks is perfectly fine. You know, there's nothing wrong with the attacks, aside from the fact that they move much too slowly. You can see that the idea for a good shoot-'em-up boss is here. It's just that I think maybe Behaviour Interactive didn't know what to do with it exactly. They didn't know how to shake it up enough to make it genuinely challenging. So it's just sort of by the numbers boss pattern stuff. If you're curious, the best weapon to hit bosses consistently without worrying is definitely the tartar sauce gun. The only issue with using the tartar sauce gun may be that, you know, one of your friends gets in the way while you're trying to fire it. The pile launcher is probably the worst weapon for a boss battle because of how slow it fires. The reef blower is really good for dealing damage, but you have to get really close to the boss to use it, which you may not like to do. All the other guns are just, you know, fine. So yeah, not much else to say about this boss besides it's functional. The later bosses are much better than this one. This one, again, arguably the easiest in the entire game. So, not a great standard. So that's it for the first world of this game. I don't think it's the absolute train wreck everyone seems to think it was. At one point, I did think it was an absolute train wreck, but upon replaying it enough times, I've been able to appreciate what the design could have been, and upon playing it in multiplayer again, it made it easier to appreciate what they were doing.
Great work, everyone! We did it! We have a key and another Enerjolt power cell. Sandy, maybe you can use this to help us find the others.
I sure can.
Okay, if my calculations are correct, and of course they always are, there is another key in rock bottom. All we have to do is... Wait a minute. Is this thing on?
Did you hear that?
Yes, sir. Plankton should really learn to control his temper.
Not that part. There's another key. We need to get there and beat him to it. Come on.